the new god of hell, the new gods of hell, the new god of hell, the new goddess of hell, the new goddesses of hell, the new goddess of hell, the old god of hell, the old gods of hell, the old god of hell, the old goddess of hell, the old goddesses of hell, the old goddess of hell, the greater god of hell, the greater gods of hell, the greater god of hell, the greater goddess of hell, the greater goddesses of hell, the greater goddess of hell, the lesser god of hell, the lesser gods of hell, the lesser god of hell, the lesser goddess of hell, the lesser goddesses of hell, the lesser goddess of hell, the higher god of hell, the higher gods of hell, the higher god of hell, the higher goddess of hell, the higher goddesses of hell, the higher goddess of hell, the lower god of hell, the lower gods of hell, the lower god of hell, the lower goddess of hell, the lower goddesses of hell, the lower goddess of hell, the greater spirit of hell, the greater spirits of hell, the greater spirit of hell, the lesser spirit of hell, the lesser spirits of hell, the lesser spirit of hell, the higher spirit of hell, the higher spirits of hell, the higher spirit of hell, the lower spirit of hell, the lower spirits of hell, the lower spirit of hell, the major god of hell, the major gods of hell, the major god of hell, the major goddess of hell, the major goddesses of hell, the major goddess of hell, the minor god of hell, the minor gods of hell, the minor god of hell, the minor goddess of hell, the minor goddesses of hell, the minor goddess of hell, the superior god of hell, the superior gods of hell, the superior god of hell, the superior goddess of hell, the superior goddesses of hell, the superior goddess of hell, the inferior god of hell, the inferior gods of hell, the inferior god of hell, the inferior goddess of hell, the inferior goddesses of hell, the inferior goddess of hell, the ancestor god of hell, the ancestor gods of hell, the ancestor god of hell, the ancestor goddess of hell, the ancestor goddesses of hell, the ancestor goddess of hell, the ascendant god of hell, the ascendant gods of hell, the ascendant god of hell, the ascendant goddess of hell, the ascendant goddesses of hell, the ascendant goddess of hell, the descendant god of hell, the descendant gods of hell, the descendant god of hell, the descendant goddess of hell, the descendant goddesses of hell, the descendant goddess of hell, the transcendent god of hell, the transcendent gods of hell, the transcendent god of hell, the transcendent goddess of hell, the transcendent goddesses of hell, the transcendent goddess of hell, the past god of hell, the past gods of hell, the past god of hell, the past goddess of hell, the past goddesses of hell, the past goddess of hell, the present god of hell, the present gods of hell, the present god of hell, the present goddess of hell, the present goddesses of hell, the present goddess of hell, the future god of hell, the future gods of hell, the future god of hell, the future goddess of hell, the future goddesses of hell, the future goddess of hell, the authentic god of hell, the authentic gods of hell, the authentic god of hell, the authentic goddess of hell, the authentic goddesses of hell, the authentic goddess of hell, the synthetic god of hell, the synthetic gods of hell, the synthetic god of hell, the synthetic goddess of hell, the synthetic goddesses of hell, the synthetic goddess of hell, the progressive god of hell, the progressive gods of hell, the progressive god of hell, the progressive goddess of hell, the progressive goddesses of hell, the progressive goddess of hell, the regressive god of hell, the regressive gods of hell, the regressive god of hell, the regressive goddess of hell, the regressive goddesses of hell, the regressive goddess of hell, the ordinary god of hell, the ordinary gods of hell, the ordinary god of hell, the ordinary goddess of hell, the ordinary goddesses of hell, the ordinary goddess of hell, the extraordinary god of hell, the extraordinary gods of hell, the extraordinary god of hell, the extraordinary goddess of hell, the extraordinary goddesses of hell, the extraordinary goddess of hell, the static god of hell, the static gods of hell, the static god of hell, the static goddess of hell, the static goddesses of hell, the static goddess of hell, the dynamic god of hell, the dynamic gods of hell, the dynamic god of hell, the dynamic goddess of hell, the dynamic goddesses of hell, the dynamic goddess of hell, the land god of hell, the land gods of hell, the land god of hell, the land goddess of hell, the land goddesses of hell, the land goddess of hell, the sea god of hell, the sea gods of hell, the sea god of hell, the sea goddess of hell, the sea goddesses of hell, the sea goddess of hell, the sky god of hell, the sky gods of hell, the sky god of hell, the sky goddess of hell, the sky goddesses of hell, the sky goddess of hell, the god of hell, the gods of hell, the god of hell, the goddess of hell, the goddesses of hell, the goddess of hell, the half god of hell, the half gods of hell, the half god of hell, the half goddess of hell, the half goddesses of hell, the half goddess of hell, the vessel of hell, the vessels of hell, the vessel of hell, the name of hell, the names of hell, the name of hell, the person of hell, the persons of hell, the person of hell, the persona of hell, the personas of hell, the persona of hell, the personage of hell, the personages of hell, the personage of hell, the personality of hell, the personalities of hell, the personality of hell, the personification of hell, the personifications of hell, the personification of hell, the image of hell, the images of hell, the image of hell, the imagination of hell, the imaginations of hell, the imagination of hell, the belief of hell, the beliefs of hell, the belief of hell, the thought of hell, the thoughts of hell, the thought of hell, the word of hell, the words of hell, the word of hell, the action of hell, the actions of hell, the action of hell, the reaction of hell, the reactions of hell, the reaction of hell, the feeling of hell, the feelings of hell, the feeling of hell, the situation of hell, the situations of hell, the situation of hell, the circumstance of hell, the circumstances of hell, the circumstance of hell, the environment of hell, the environments of hell, the environment of hell, the relationship of hell, the relationships of hell, the relationship of hell, the number of hell, the numbers of hell, the number of hell, the formula of hell, the formulas of hell, the formula of hell, the equation of hell, the equations of hell, the equation of hell, the theory of hell, the theories of hell, the theory of hell, the symbol of hell, the symbols of hell, the symbol of hell, the color of hell, the colors of hell, the color of hell, the thing of hell, the things of hell, the thing of hell, the way of hell, the ways of hell, the way of hell, the place of hell, the places of hell, the place of hell, the time of hell, the times of hell, the time of hell, the event of hell, the events of hell, the event of hell, the result of hell, the results of hell, the result of hell, the crown of hell, the crowns of hell, the crown of hell, the throne of hell, the thrones of hell, the throne of hell, the Hell King, the Hell Kings, the Hell Kingdom, the Hell Kingdoms, the Hell King subject, the Hell King subjects, the Hell King's dominion, the Hell King's dominions, the kingdom of hell, the kingdoms of hell, the kingdom of hell, the Hell Queen, the Hell Queens, the Hell Queendom, the Hell Queendoms, the Hell Queen's subject, the Hell Queen's subjects, the Hell Queen's dominion, the Hell Queen's dominions, the Queendom of hell, the Queendoms of hell, the Queendom of hell, the Hell Prince, the Hell Princes, the Hell Princedom, the Hell Princedoms, the Hell Prince's subject, the Hell Prince's subjects, the Hell Prince's dominion, the Hell Prince's dominions, the Princedom of hell, the Princedoms of hell, the Princedom of hell, the Hell Princess, the Hell Princesses, The Hell Princess Dom. The Hell Princess Doms. The Hell Princess's subject. The Hell Princess's subjects. The Hell Princess's dominion. The Hell Princess's dominions. The Princess Dom of Hell. The Princess Doms of Hell. The Princess Dom of Hell. The Lord of Hell. The Lords of Hell. The Lord of Hell. The Lordess of Hell. The Lordesses of Hell. The Lordess of Hell. The Priest of Hell. The Priests of Hell. The Priest of Hell. The Priestess of Hell. The Priestesses of Hell. The Priestess of Hell. The Ritual of Hell. The Rituals of Hell. The Ritual of Hell. The Shrine of Hell. The Shrines of Hell. The Shrine of Hell. The Temple of Hell. The Temples of Hell. The Temple of Hell. The Leader of Hell. The Leaders of Hell. The Leader of Hell. The Follower of Hell. The Followers of Hell. The Follower of Hell. The Natural Substance of Hell. The Natural Substances of Hell. The Natural Substance of Hell. The Supernatural Substance of Hell. The Supernatural Substances of Hell. The Supernatural Substance of Hell. The Temporal Substance of Hell. The Temporal Substances of Hell. The Temporal Substance of Hell. The Spiritual Substance of Hell. The Spiritual Substances of Hell. The Spiritual Substance of Hell. The Natural Form of Hell. The Natural Forms of Hell. The Natural Form of Hell. The Supernatural Form of Hell. The Supernatural Forms of Hell. The Supernatural Form of Hell. The Temporal Form of Hell. The Temporal Forms of Hell. The Temporal Form of Hell. The Spiritual Form of Hell. The Spiritual Forms of Hell. The Spiritual Form of Hell. The Age of Hell. The Ages of Hell. The Age of Hell. The Era of Hell. The Heiress of Hell. The Era of Hell. The Awakener of Hell. The Awakeners of Hell. The Awakener of Hell. The Awakening of Hell. The Awakenings of Hell. The Awakening of Hell. The Realm of Hell. The Realms of Hell. The Realm of Hell. The Dimension of Hell. The Dimensions of Hell. The Dimension of Hell. The Zone of Hell. The Zones of Hell. The Zone of Hell. The Frequency of Hell. The Frequencies of Hell. The Frequency of Hell. The Century of Hell. The Centuries of Hell. The Century of Hell. The Millennium of Hell. The Millenniums of Hell. The Millennium of Hell. The Purpose of Hell. The Purposes of Hell. The Purpose of Hell. The Meaning of Hell. The Meanings of Hell. The Meaning of Hell. The Culture of Hell. The Cultures of Hell. The Culture of Hell. The Demonstrator of Hell. The Demonstrators of Hell. The Demonstrator of Hell. The Demonstration of Hell. The Demonstrations of Hell. The Demonstration of Hell. The Manifester of Hell. The Manifestors of Hell. The Manifester of Hell. The Manifestation of Hell. The Manifestations of Hell. The Manifestation of Hell. The Presence of Hell. The Presences of Hell. The Presence of Hell. The Glow of Hell. The Glows of Hell. The Glow of Hell. The Goal of Hell. The Goals of Hell. The Goal of Hell. The Plan of Hell. The Plans of Hell. The Plan of Hell. The Book of Hell. The Books of Hell. The Book of Hell. The Philosopher of Hell. The Philosophers of Hell. The Philosopher of Hell. The Philosophy of Hell. The Philosophies of Hell. The Philosophy of Hell. The Releaser of Hell. The Releasers of Hell. The Releaser of Hell. The Release of Hell. The Releases of Hell. The Release of Hell. The Variable of Hell. The Variables of Hell. The Variable of Hell. The Cause of Hell. The Causes of Hell. The Cause of Hell. The Effect of Hell. The Effects of Hell. The Effect of Hell. The Journey of Hell. The Journeys of Hell. The Journey of Hell. The Emergence of Hell. The Emergences of Hell. The Emergence of Hell. The Source of Hell. The Sources of Hell. The Source of Hell. The Originator of Hell. The Originators of Hell. The Originator of Hell. The Origin of Hell. The Origins of Hell. The Origin of Hell. The Forefather of Hell. The Forefathers of Hell. The Forefather of Hell. The Foremother of Hell. The Foremothers of Hell. The Foremother of Hell. The Ancestor of Hell. The Ancestors of Hell. The Ancestor of Hell. The Descendant of Hell. The Descendants of Hell. the descendant of hell, the lineage of hell, the lineages of hell, the lineage of hell, the heritage of hell, the heritages of hell, the heritage of hell, the heir of hell, the heirs of hell, the heir of hell, the co-heir of hell, the co-heirs of hell, the co-heir of hell, the joint heir of hell, the joint heirs of hell, the joint heir of hell, the dynasty of hell, the dynasties of hell, the dynasty of hell, the force of hell, the forces of hell, the force of hell, the law of hell, the laws of hell, the law of hell, the pact of hell, the pacts of hell, the pact of hell, the game of hell, the games of hell, the game of hell, the mask of hell, the masks of hell, the mask of hell, the armor of hell, the armors of hell, the armor of hell, the sword of hell, the swords of hell, the sword of hell, the shield of hell, the shields of hell, the shield of hell, the force shield of hell, the force shields of hell, the force shield of hell, the armored force shield of hell, the armored force shields of hell, the armored force shield of hell, the champion of hell, the champions of hell, the champion of hell, the guardian of hell, the guardians of hell, the guardian of hell, the defender of hell, the defenders of hell, the defender of hell, the protector of hell, the protectors of hell, the protector of hell, the chant of hell, the chants of hell, the chant of hell, the shape of hell, the shapes of hell, the shape of hell, the cube of hell, the cubes of hell, the cube of hell, the cuboid of hell, the cuboids of hell, the cuboid of hell, the sphere of hell, the spheres of hell, the sphere of hell, the spheroid of hell, the spheroids of hell, the spheroid of hell, the prism of hell, the prisms of hell, the prism of hell, the pyramid of hell, the pyramids of hell, the pyramid of hell, the cylinder of hell, the cylinders of hell, the cylinder of hell, the cone of hell, the cones of hell, the cone of hell, the triangle of hell, the triangles of hell, the triangle of hell, the circle of hell, the circles of hell, the circle of hell, the semicircle of hell, the semicircles of hell, the semicircle of hell, the square of hell, the squares of hell, the square of hell, the rectangle of hell, the rectangles of hell, the rectangle of hell, the parallelogram of hell, the parallelograms of hell, the parallelogram of hell, the rhombus of hell, the rhombuses of hell, the rhombus of hell, the trapezoid of hell, the trapezoids of hell, the trapezoid of hell, the polygon of hell, the polygons of hell, the polygon of hell, the pentagon of hell, the pentagons of hell, the pentagon of hell, the hexagon of hell, the hexagons of hell, the hexagon of hell, the septagon of hell, the septagons of hell, the septagon of hell, the octagon of hell, the octagons of hell, the octagon of hell, the nonagon of hell, the nonagons of hell, the nonagon of hell, the decagon of hell, the decagons of hell, the decagon of hell, the evolution of hell, the evolutions of hell, the evolution of hell, the revolution of hell, the revolutions of hell, the revolution of hell, the elemental art of hell, the elemental arts of hell, the elemental art of hell, the elemental science of hell, the elemental sciences of hell, the elemental science of hell, the elemental principle of hell, the elemental principles of hell, the elemental principle of hell, the elemental technology of hell, the elemental technologies of hell, the elemental technology of hell, the low elemental art of hell, the low elemental arts of hell, the low elemental art of hell, the low elemental science of hell, the low elemental sciences of hell, the low elemental science of hell, the low elemental principle of hell, the low elemental principles of hell, the low elemental principle of hell, the low elemental technology of hell, the low elemental technologies of hell, the low elemental technology of hell, the high elemental art of hell, the high elemental arts of hell, the high elemental art of hell, the high elemental science of hell, the high elemental sciences of hell, the high elemental science of hell, the high elemental principle of hell, the high elemental principles of hell, the high elemental principle of hell, the high elemental technology of hell, the high elemental technologies of hell, the high elemental technology of hell, the agent of hell, the agents of hell, the agent of hell, the agency of hell, the agencies of hell, the agency of hell, the amplifier of hell, the amplifiers of hell, the amplifier of hell, the amplification of hell, the amplifications of hell, the amplification of hell, the enhancer of hell, the enhancers of hell, the enhancer of hell, the enhancement of hell, the enhancements of hell, the enhancement of hell, the magnifier of hell, the magnifiers of hell, the magnifier of hell, the magnification of hell, the magnifications of hell, the magnification of hell, the influencer of hell, the influencers of hell, the influencer of hell, the influence of hell, the influences of hell, the influence of hell, the emanator of hell, the emanators of hell, the emanator of hell, the emanation of hell, the emanations of hell, the emanation of hell, the converger of hell, the convergers of hell, the converger of hell, the convergence of hell, the convergences of hell, the convergence of hell, the aura of hell, the auras of hell, the aura of hell, the impression of hell, the impressions of hell, the impression of hell, the intelligence of hell, the intelligences of hell, the intelligence of hell, the sophistication of hell, the sophistications of hell, the sophistication of hell, the genius of hell, the geniuses of hell, the genius of hell, the polymath of hell, the polymaths of hell, the polymath of hell, the psychic of hell, the psychics of hell, the psychic of hell, the knowledge of hell, the knowledges of hell, the knowledge of hell, the understanding of hell, the understandings of hell, the understanding of hell, the wisdom of hell, the wisdoms of hell, the wisdom of hell, the secret of hell, the secrets of hell, the secret of hell, the mystery of hell, the mysteries of hell, the mystery of hell, the revelation of hell, the revelations of hell, the revelation of hell, the tactic of hell, the tactics of hell, the tactic of hell, the strategy of hell, the strategies of hell, the strategy of hell, the strength of hell, the strengths of hell, the strength of hell, the might of hell, the might of hell, the might of hell, the power of hell, the powers of hell, the power of hell, the authority of hell, the authorities of hell, the authority of hell, the dominion of hell, the dominions of hell, the dominion of hell, the rhythm of hell, the rhythms of hell, the rhythm of hell, the melody of hell, the melodies of hell, the melody of hell, the music of hell, the musics of hell, the music of hell, the lyric of hell, the lyrics of hell, the lyric of hell, the song of hell, the songs of hell, the song of hell, the dance of hell, the dances of hell, the dance of hell, the spirit of hell, the spirits of hell, the spirit of hell, the soul of hell, the souls of hell, the soul of hell, the body of hell, the bodies of hell, the body of hell, the mark of hell, the marks of hell, the mark of hell, the promise of hell, the promises of hell, the promise of hell, the visionary of hell, the visionaries of hell, the visionary of hell, the vision of hell, the visions of hell, the vision of hell, the picture of hell, the pictures of hell, the picture of hell, the sound of hell, the sounds of hell, the sound of hell, the tongue of hell, the tongues of hell, the tongue of hell, the language of hell, the languages of hell, the language of hell, the communication of hell, the communications of hell, the communication of hell, the people of hell, the peoples of hell, the people of hell, the society of hell, the societies of hell, the society of hell, the fortress of hell, the fortresses of hell, the fortress of hell, the government of hell, the governments of hell, the government of hell, the city of hell, the cities of hell, the city of hell, the nation of hell, the nations of hell, the nation of hell, the civilization of hell, the civilizations of hell, the civilization of hell, the world of hell, the worlds of hell, the world of hell,